One of them wanted to be the security guy. He claimed he was a security guy.
Welcome back to Security Guy Radio with Chuck Harold and
Paul Tally-Ho-Bristow.
Paul Tally-Ho-Bristow. Well, boy, we've been busy today with these 2 other shows.
Yeah, I'm exhausted.
So, as part of the January's National Stalker Awareness Month, we're going to do another show on stalking today. Did you get any more feedback from our show last week with Kathleen?
Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah,
it was
lots of
very
emails
interesting. Yeah, that's a perspective from a victim, and I think that is one way to look at it, right? But the question is, how do you put this all together? She did it all herself, really.
Yeah.
I mean, she just got it done and had it happen. And I was contacted by another friend of mine. I used to work with at Disney, and her husband, I think for about 10 years, came after her, violently, psychologically and violently. Yeah. She might come on the show and talk
I don't think everybody's equipped. Not everybody is equipped to deal with it.
Not personally. Yeah. But I think a bigger challenge sometimes is the law enforcement side of it.
Yeah.
Do they know what to do? Do they want to do something about it? And they're just not sure. It's too complicated. I mean, in essence, stalking reports are probable cause reports, where you're putting together multiple elements that in and of themselves separately don't equal a crime.
Yeah.
But altogether, they do, right? So we want to talk about that. And on the line with me right now is Miss Pam Paz, our crisis coach. Pam, you there?
I'm here.
Calling us from where? Beautiful Chicago?
Beautiful. Yeah, it's balmy here today.
Balmy. Was it 54 degrees or what is it?
Yeah, something in the 40s.
40s. Oh, it's toasty. It was 15 below last week.
Yeah, about an 80-degree change.
Oh, was it like 75 here?
Well, yeah, it was hot today.
Yeah, we're on.
Well, I was going to go out to Chicago last week to work with Pam on a job, and I think when I was supposed to land, it was 50 below zero, some ridiculous thing. And that's crazy. Well, Pam's going to help us because, Pam, you, for people that haven't listened in yet before, tell everybody about your background and why this is close to your heart.
Well, as we've talked about before, I started the domestic violence division for the prosecutor's office back in 1997. But a growing problem, and Michelle's here to be our, to give us the background on the center and why it was started is, long ago, before even stalking laws were created, poor victims really had not much. They'd have somebody that was following them, threatening them, and stalking comes kind of in crumbles, It's not like a battery where you're sitting there with a black eye and you have medical records and you have a photograph, Stalking is a series of followings and maybe a threat, and as I said, it kind of comes in pieces. And a lot of times, you'll go to the police department and they'll say, well, right now we don't really have anything. It's just one following. Keep a journal, keep a log, do this, do that. And victims would always say when they'd come to the prosecutor's office, they'd say, what do I have to do? Do I have to wait until he kills me, until someone's going to do something about this?
What was your biggest challenge?
Thankfully, now in every state we do have stalking laws, but it's still very difficult. There are not as many stalking prosecutions as I think there should be, a lot of times because, as I said, they kind of come in crumbles here, and it takes a lot to work these cases up and to get them to the proper authorities to be prosecuted.
So what was your biggest challenge on the legal side of it? When somebody came to your office,
obviously proving the case, you don't have medical records, you don't have photographs a lot of times. It's this series of following and really conveying to the judge that this is a serious case. When I worked with the FBI, we studied hundreds of domestic violence homicides. In the majority of the homicides, right before the homicide occurred, 3 to 6 months before, there was evidence of stalking behavior. So we know when you see stalking, that's a very high predictor of future violence.
Did you find that the victims weren't aware of what the behavior was? You had to get it out of them? Or did your office have to build the case up and go out and reinvestigate it, in essence?
No, the victims definitely, the victims were, once someone, usually when stalking comes into play after somebody's terminated the relationship. So you break it off, right? They don't know where you live anymore, but they certainly know where you work. So they start following you. Work hours are very predictable. How you get to work is very predictable, right? So they're waiting for you in the parking lot. They're following you. And you get that type of behavior, So, and the victims know they're afraid of this individual, They've told them not to have any more contact, and they refuse, to abide by the victim's wishes. And so the victims reaching out, a lot of times, unfortunately, the support's just not there for them.
Is it a specific intent crime or a general intent crime? Stalking.
Actually, every state varies as far as what kind of crime, and Michelle, please correct me. It's been a while since I've been in the courtrooms, but I believe in some states it's a misdemeanor, and in some states it's a felony. For example, in Illinois, stalking is a felony.
Well, we're just a couple of security guy hosts, and we don't know what we're talking about, right, Paul?
I know nothing.
That's why we bring in the guest speakers that know what they're talking about. And so our guest today is Michelle Garcia. She's the director of the Stalking Resource Center, which is inside the National Crime Victim Center. Is that correct, Michelle?
National Center for Victims of Crime.
Close enough. Sorry about that.
Very close.
The pepper sprays had me off my game today.
I could have told you that because I'm
I
looking
must
at the website.
Of course, if I had my spectacles, I could do that as well. I apologize.
No, that's fine.
So tell us what the center does in general, and then let's talk about the specific division you're in charge of.
So the National Center for Victims of Crime is the nation's largest crime advocacy organization that works on all crime victim issues, that's working to really build and enhance the nation's response to all crime victimization. My program, specifically the Stalking Resource Center, we focus on the crime of stalking, and we were founded in 2000 to work with professionals and organizations, agencies, and communities to enhance their abilities to recognize and effectively respond to stalking in order to try and keep victims safe and hold offenders accountable. And we established the Stalking Resource Center in partnership with the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women, which is also the primary funder for the Stalking Resource Center.
So you don't represent the victim itself. Victims aren't calling you. You're working with the professionals to...
Correct. We don't provide direct services to victims. What we'll typically do is try and refer victims back to resources in their own community who are best equipped to help them navigate those systems. But what we try and do is we train those service providers in their own community or those responders. So law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, probation, parole, victim advocates, victim service providers, really any professional who might be working with a victim or an offender.
How does the process work? Do people contact you? Do you have a outsourced outreach program where you contact the departments, or how do people know about you?
Typically, people contact us for training. So if you go to our website, which is victimsofcrime.org, and go to the Stalking Resource Center, we have a page on training talking about the variety of training topics that we can present on, and also how to go about requesting training. And a large portion of our constituency are actually funding recipients through the Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women, so individuals who receive grants through that office to address the crimes of stalking, domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual assault.
What do you when you deal with this is Paul? Sorry, when you
I think we know
if you
from the
didn't
accent.
catch the accent,
Yes.
but it's when you deal with law enforcement, in particular, what do you find is I always sort of say there's a missing link with a lot of guys that are out on the street, guys and girls that are out on the street, that they don't understand the domestic violence side and stalking and all that. Why do you think that's, well, number one, do you think that that's true? And number two, why do you think that's true?
Well, I think the law enforcement response to stalking is so critical because really those first responders, those patrol officers, they're the gatekeepers to the entire criminal justice system. Their response in so many ways determines whether that victim will ever report again, the case ever gets elevated to a detective or investigator, ever gets charged and put in front of a prosecutor. And so there's such a critical component. And I think, unfortunately, so often first responders are still not prepared to effectively address stalking. That in many cases, in many jurisdictions, when we talk to law enforcement, there's very little training that happens on the academy level or ongoing education about recognizing stalking. And as Pam was talking about earlier, this is a course of conduct crime, that it's lots of different incidents that so often by themselves are not going to be crimes, so they often get missed. that you might have a victim who reports that they're receiving, these troubling text messages, or that the offender keeps showing up in a public place or making phone calls. Well, individually, those may not be criminal acts, and if law enforcement isn't trained to put all those pieces together to really see that full pattern, then they're not going to necessarily see the crime of stalking occurring. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we often hear, both from victims and from law enforcement themselves.
Give us a definition, a broad definition of stalking as a law.
Sure.
What would cover
So,
most states?
Well, every state has a stalking statute, and there's some similarities and differences. But the definition that we typically use is that stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear.
Either psychological or physical?
Sure.
Okay.
Any type of fear, whether that's fear of bodily injury, fear of harm, fear of sexual assault, fear of death, either to themselves or to someone else in the way that most of the laws are written.
So that's an objective or subjective standard. The holder of the fear is the victim, I suppose, or the reasonable person.
It's interesting because in different states it's actually written in different ways. In some cases it's that the victim is experiencing it, but in some cases it's that a reasonable person would experience that fear.
That's a better definition, I think.
Well, and it's a really important piece because so often we know that victims will often minimize that fear. That
Right.
So often when we look at the research, when either the stalking is first occurring, that victims aren't necessarily saying that they're afraid. They might be concerned or anxious or angry, and that it might evolve to fear, or that you may have some who will never admit or articulate that they're afraid, even if their behaviors demonstrate fear.
Right.
We also look at what we know about the intersection between stalking and domestic violence, and if you have someone who has been experiencing this type of violence, this type of behavior, and we know that often with domestic violence, the stalking begins long before the victim ends the relationship, that this might be normalized, and so they're not necessarily afraid of it. So that reasonable person standard is really critical, and most states have either a victim fear or a reasonable person. Some states actually require both.
How does a victim translate that fear into evidence? Because I think that's getting back to the law enforcement side. That's a big part of law enforcement trying to understand, right?
Right, absolutely, because fear is a difficult concept, right? It's subjective. We are not all afraid of the same things, and what might seem harmless to me might be terrifying to you. And so that becomes a really critical piece, both in terms of victims trying to convey that when they are reporting, but also it's really critical on the part of law enforcement to be asking those questions to try and elicit that when they may not be hearing it immediately from a victim. So you might have a victim who doesn't say they're afraid, or even if you ask them, they may not say, maybe, not really. But then you start asking them, well, tell me, what has changed since this behavior has started? Well, they've enhanced their security. They've put bars on their windows. They've gotten an alarm system. They changed their routines. They don't go to the gym anymore. They've stopped going out and socializing with their friends because they're afraid the offender is going to show up. And I think objectively we could look at those behaviors and say, yeah, those are the actions of someone who's afraid. So it's really often dependent on law enforcement to be identifying that, because in so many cases victims themselves won't be articulating it.
Well, I think that's a super important point, because there are some people that just aren't afraid of things, okay? And if you had a standard in a state that said that the victim needs to be in fear and, objectively feel subjectively be in fear, okay? And if she's not articulating that she is and she's not in fear, does the crime not occur? There seems to be a gap here, because in the old domestic violence cases, if the wife didn't prosecute the husband for beating her and said, I want him arrested, we couldn't do anything about it. That's all changed as far as in all states now. Cops have to go out and arrest, battering husbands or wives, right? But in a stalking case, which, a lot of cases are domestic violence driven, how could you have a gap that says, well, this state, we don't require, a subjective fear, so therefore we're not going to file it. It seems like they're missing something on that one. I can see the states where there's a reasonable person standard. That makes a lot of sense, because then I can prosecute and get this guy off the street, even if you, the victim, don't want me to. But are you saying in some states you can't always do that as law enforcement? You cannot get him off the street unless the victim cooperates?
Yeah, and it goes to some of the questions that you were asking earlier about the specific intent versus general intent, and some of what Pam was talking about. When we look at our stalking laws, there's common elements, even though all the states may deal with it a little differently. And the intent is one piece, the standard of fear is one, the level of fear is another, and each of those can pose unique challenges. We have actually done work to try and come up what we think is really the model statute for stalking, and in 2007 actually published a model code that gives guidance for states to enact legislation that is both constitutionally sound but also the most reflective of the actual experience of victims. And so I think some of what we talk about in that document is addressing exactly what you were saying. And actually one of our recommendations is that we actually move away from even this fear standard, or at least start being inclusive of this concept of emotional distress or substantial emotional distress for those very things that you were talking about, that sometimes it can be hard to prove fear or difficult if you have someone who's not articulating fear. And I also think we have to think sometimes about the victims we don't immediately think about when we think about stalking. When we think about male victims, that in our society, so often males are not socialized to admit when they're afraid, and so that becomes an additional challenge when we're talking about those victims. So,
interesting concept. Let's hold that thought, and we're going to take a break here and be right back with Michelle Garcia of the Stalking Resource Center on Security Guy Radio. Welcome back to Security Guy Radio with today's very serious topic, which does not need the jolly break music we're hearing right now. Isn't that a little too happy for stalker music?
Yeah, just a little bit.
It's not quite stalker music.
Unless you're a stalker.
I'm sorry, I don't know. These are all labeled. This one's called Classic Royale.
Well, unless you're a Broadway showman stalker, I suppose it would be appropriate. Anyway, welcome back to our show with Michelle Garcia from the Stalking Resource Center. Pam Paz, also known as Pam Pisiotopoulos from Chicago. Pam, are you there?
I'm here.
I want you to jump in, Pam. Let's talk about some background. Michelle, you really sound like you're an attorney, but you're not an attorney.
I've just got to interject this one little story because we was talking about male victims of stalking.
Yeah. And
not that long ago, but a few years ago when I was a copper in England, and I was at the local station, which was Tottenham, which was where all the riots occurred a few years ago. Very, very heavy West Indian community, great people, but one occasion where a male, a husband had been
a male husband.
A male husband. Well, but he was a victim of some pretty bad domestic violence.
Physical.
I mean, it was bad, and his wife had really been beating him up for several years. But I ended up arresting the wife. The problem was when we got to the court, literally the people in the court were laughing at the victim because he'd been beaten up. So I mean it was pretty bad, and we did have a lot of domestic violence going on. In the UK, everybody goes down to the pub on Sunday, and it's pretty bad over there still. So
Michelle,
I've had lots of victims that were males that were stalked by their exes, and it's pretty terrorizing. The problem is, for one, I had one guy, he was 6'6", really huge, big guy, former football player, and his ex-girlfriend was 4'10", 90 pounds, and who's going to take him seriously? But she was really terrorizing him, breaking into his email and sending messages to him, just making his professional and personal life complete hell. But anytime he went to report it, the police officers were laughing at him. The security person at his firm, he was a lawyer, are you kidding, guy? She's, 4'10", 90 pounds. So I think it's really difficult when males are victims for them to be able to come forward, but there's no question about it, and I'm sure Michelle's had numerous cases as well. It's an extra barrier for men that are victims.
any stats on that? Percentage of female victims to male victims?
Well, actually, when we look at what the prevalence rates are, at least over the course of a lifetime, about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 13 men will be stalked at some point in their life.
Just the general population?
Just in the general population.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That's pretty
worrying.
Well, like we said in the last show, I've had a stalker. You say you have not had a stalker.
Well,
Apparently
not
you're not
that I'm
very
going to
interesting.
admit to. Yeah.
No, but I mean,
Michelle, let me ask you this. We had, there was a tragedy involving a woman. Her name was Cindy Bischoff. Are you familiar with that case?
I'm
It was
familiar
in
with her
2008.
case,
And as you know, her family's set up the Cindy Bischoff Foundation, and they've really done some pretty amazing things. So they instituted this GPS system. So if somebody violated a protective order, they'd be, given this bracelet. Unfortunately, because of funding, a lot of things fell through the cracks, and it hasn't been implemented the way it should be. But in your experience across the country, are we moving this way towards GPS tracking systems? So if an individual is under some kind of probation or supervision and they violate the terms of their release, that, these automated voice alerts can, either notify officers or the victim or someone to prevent a further tragedy.
We are increasingly seeing it as an option in more jurisdictions across the country, but the challenges are very much what you've already talked about, that it's often a funding issue. Often it's the offender who's actually required to pay for the monitoring service, and in many cases you might have an offender who doesn't have that capacity, and so then it falls on to the jurisdiction to assume those costs, and in lots of jurisdictions they just don't have those resources, and so decisions are being made about which are the most high-risk cases we're trying to triage. I think there's great promise in GPS monitoring, both in terms of pretrial release or offenders who might be on probation or parole. We just need to get it fully resourced in order for it to be effective. And the one caution I'll add about it is I think it's a great tool. It can be an excellent tool to try and enhance victim safety and manage that offender. But we also don't want to end up in a place where victims are thinking it's an absolute guarantee of safety, because we know that there's a very high recidivism rate amongst stalkers, even after arrest, even after being put on an order of protection. And I would have no reason to believe that just having a monitoring anklet on them, for many of them, would stop them from engaging in those same behaviors. And in many cases, there is that lag between when an offender violates sort of the location limitations, and by the time law enforcement can show up, something tragic could actually occur, and that victim could be harmed or ultimately killed. And so I just want to be cautious that we look at it as a resource, we look at it as a great tool that can be used, but that we don't want to end up in a place where victims might be thinking this would guarantee their safety.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, I don't think they can ever really, have that kind of having their guard down, unless somebody's incarcerated or there's been enough time that's passed, where they've either moved on or something like that. What do you think of, I know you know Mark Wynn, his Stalk the Stalker philosophy, in the corporate world, Chuck and I, dealt with various corporations and employees there that have the means and they want to hire their own bodyguards or their own security guards. I've had several doctors that have hired, a security guard because their ex-husbands were stalking them, and so they've had a security guard sitting in their waiting rooms. And, Mark Wynn's philosophy is stalk the stalker, have somebody on the stalker, 24/7, as opposed to somebody following you around. That way, you can catch him in the act, or you can catch him before he busts into your office or does whatever he's going to do. What are your thoughts on the stalk the stalker philosophy?
Yeah, we work with Mark quite a bit, and he's an amazing resource and was a detective for many years and now is an internationally recognized trainer on the topics of domestic violence and stalking. And really what he gets at when he talks about the stalker concept is these offenders, these can be some of the easiest cases for law enforcement because we typically know who the offender is. We know the victim. We know the patterns of behavior because they're going to keep doing these same things time and time again. And if we engage in some of the very same behaviors in terms of monitoring, tracking, surveillance, to actually try and document this person engaging in these behaviors, then we can actually often catch him in the act and collect that evidence and have that evidence that could lead to a successful prosecution. And so really it's about law enforcement taking some of the same tactics that these offenders use and turning the tables on them. And whether that's doing it, physically, where you might have a patrol who, sits on a victim's house 24/7, or you can use some of the very same technologies. And whether it's a law enforcement agency who owns those technologies themselves, or using some of the resources available to law enforcement, like RIS, the Regional Information Sharing Systems, or RCFL, the Regional Computer Forensics Laboratories, RIS, who will loan equipment to police departments to use in these investigations, as well as assist with analysis and additional support.
Welcome back to Security Guy Radio. I must say that's a little better music, Brian. Very
Feel way more serious.
very much better music.
Yeah.
So Paul and I were talking at the break, Michelle, and we were wondering this: what's the scoop on the personality? We just learned something very interesting, that somebody that's going to get to you as a victim is going to stalk people around you to instill more fear in you, and so on. But do those people that do that, would they, not stalk the next girlfriend or boyfriend? Is it triggered by behavior of the victim? And I don't want to sound politically incorrect and all that kind of thing. But, boy, we've all been in relationships where somebody just really teases us off and you feel powerless, and then you're gonna act out. Is that just the personality of a stalker who's going to act that way with everybody, or is it incident specific?
See, I've always believed that everybody's got
The potential.
that in them, and most people can just control it.
It's an impulse control
Yeah.
issue. That's
what
it's
I've
hard- I
always
don't know.
believed. But
Yeah. Michelle, what say you?
It's an interesting question, and we're talking about a crime that's already really complex in many ways, and I'm going to make it even more complicated in that when we look at offenders who engage in these behaviors, there's no one specific motivation. There's no one specific type of stalker. If we look at the research around typologies, there's not a consensus on typologies of stalkers, but they often range anywhere from 3 different categories to upwards of a dozen different categories. Sometimes it's based on the relationship between the victim and the offender. Sometimes it's based on the motivation of the behavior, which might be based within a relationship, might be part of domestic violence, might be occurring out of rejection or obsession. In some cases, there might be an element of mental illness or a mental health issue with the offender. There are some individuals who are engaging in these courses of conduct because they may genuinely believe this is what you're supposed to do in order to either win somebody's affection or try and win somebody back post-breakup. I mean, we more often see this when we're talking about adolescents or young adults, and so it's really difficult to answer that question because it depends. It'll depend on the unique situation. It'll depend on the relationship between the victim and the offender. It'll depend on the circumstances that are happening in that given moment in time. There's no definitive way we can really, unfortunately, there's no definitive way we can really answer that question.
Who's doing the work on the stats? Well, that's not a good question. Who's doing the work on interviewing suspects or stalkers post-act? I mean, we look at their behavior in the crime report. We document that. But does anybody sit down with them and say, okay, dude, you're in jail now for a couple of years. Do society a favor. Let's talk about what's going on in your head. Let's study why you do it. What's the cause and effect issues there?
Yeah, there has been some work done with offenders. I mean, there's a bit of a challenge in doing this because so often these cases are still underreported, so we don't necessarily have a whole lot of offenders who either end up in the criminal justice system and are either convicted of the crime or who might be in treatment facilities to, provide a researcher with a sample to do this. But there has been some work done. Chris Mahandi has actually done work with a fairly large sample of stalkers in North America and has done interviews with them and, has created his own set of typologies around the work that he has done with those offenders. So there is some of that work being done. But again, our challenge is that, we don't necessarily always have those offenders to interview. Most often, we're going to be working with the victims, whether we're a law enforcement officer or a victim service provider. In some cases, we may get to the offender. We might be able to arrest them. We might be able to prosecute them. But so often, that doesn't necessarily occur.
So do
you think looking at it from, a lot of victims, obviously, after they've been through this, somehow they get reconnected or they get information about a prior relationship that the stalker had. And, as you said, they're sort of serial offenders. And so sort of from a prevention aspect, when you're dating somebody in the beginning, would you agree, Michelle, a lot of times these guys are very charismatic in the beginning. And, they're able to kind of really draw the victim in initially in that honeymoon phase. And a lot of times you don't ask the questions, if we start probing a little more, how did your last relationship end? Maybe by obtaining that information about the prior relationship, maybe you're able to, to get out of the relationship quicker.
Oh, do we lose Michelle?
Michelle?
Nope, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Just had a little phone issue.
Oh, sorry about
I definitely think that, often what we see is these offenders who are going to engage in these behaviors from relationship to relationship to relationship. And I think often, though, even if you were to ask some of those questions of those offenders themselves, it would not have all been their fault that the relationship ended, and it would have been nothing based on their behavior, and they were probably the aggrieved party in the breakup. Because often they'll just spin it in their own mind to think of it in a way that justifies their behavior. But sometimes if you have access to that information in other ways, a lot of the cases that we have looked at, and unfortunately some of the cases that have ended up in tragedy, and we go back and we do essentially those fatality reviews. Law enforcement officers or community organizations who do these, they find that when they start talking to family members or when they start talking to the folks from the previous relationships, yep, absolutely, you see it. They've done this before. They've done it multiple times before. But for that person who's newly in a relationship with them, they don't necessarily at those beginning points either have access to their past partners or have access to their family, or who family may not even share that information with someone. They may see it as a private matter or a family matter. And so I think it would be great if we had opportunities, if any of us who were engaging in relationships had those opportunities to get some of that information, because I think often you will see that this has occurred previously, and in many cases, many times.
Michelle,
yeah, unfortunately, though, like you said, these stalkers are, they're very skilled at what they do, and so they're very, very convincing. So they're able to spin, their past relationship to make it look as though, as you said, that they're the victim. Michelle, would you mind commenting? You have an outstanding DVD that I actually use in my class. I teach intimate partner violence in the law at Kent Law School on technology. Would you mind commenting on that particular resource? Because I really think it's great for our listeners to hear about what you offer and how they can obtain a copy of it.
Oh, thank you. This is a resource that we developed a couple years ago now. It's a 15-minute training DVD on the use of technology to stalk, and really it's geared towards law enforcement, particularly first responders, but can be used with any professional who's working these cases, who's working with victims or offenders, and it's really a primer. It's an introduction on some of the most common forms of technologies that we see stalkers using, so that we start thinking about what technology can make possible, and that it facilitates the behavior that the offender is engaging in and gives them so many more tools and resources to be able to surveil, track, monitor, communicate, harass, intimidate the victims. And really the bottom line that we want to leave folks who view the video with is that when it comes to the technology, it makes the seemingly improbable possible. And so when you're hearing those stories from victims that might sound unbelievable, take a step back and see, is there some form of technology that could make that possible? So that's one resource we have. We also have a companion online training course on the use of technology to stalk. So this is a 60 to 90-minute self-paced course folks can do in multiple sittings, so they don't have to do it all at once. There is a certification process for anyone who's interested to that. And again, both of these resources are available to any professional working on these cases, working with victims or offenders. And if you go to our website, which is victimsofcrime.org/SRC for Stalking Resource Center, you can either order copies of the video or register for the class.
Oh, that's great. And let me ask you this, and I'm sure you get this question all the time, but if I'm a victim of stalking and I go to the police department, right, and I'm like, he was standing in my work parking lot, standing outside my house, I got 3 text messages today, and the police are just doing nothing. They're just writing reports. They're not charging him with anything. I'm completely frustrated, and I get your phone number, Michelle, and I call you. What advice are you going to give me?
Well, most often what we'll do is we'll try and connect any victim who reaches out to us with a resource in their own community who can help them best navigate those systems. So as a national organization, there's no way that we can keep track of how every single police department or how every single prosecutor's office responds, or who to go talk to in your county to get an order of protection. So what we will always try and do is connect somebody back to a local service provider. And I really think one of the best options available to stalking victims is to connect with a local victim service provider in their community. Often that might be the local domestic violence program or the sexual assault program or general victim services agencies. But these are really the resources who can walk victims through their options. So, what they should consider if they want to report to law enforcement, what would be helpful in terms of documentation and evidence, and creating a stalking behavior log to bring in to help demonstrate everything they've been experienced, who can talk to them about whether they would qualify for a protection order and the process about that, who can really explain what rights or options they have both within our criminal and civil justice systems, and also be that support person. These are absolutely trying experiences and traumatizing experiences for the victims, and so it's really critical that they get connected with folks who can provide support, who can provide resources, who can work with them and help them make informed decisions. And so we really think it can be absolutely beneficial if victims connect with those service providers in their own community who can assist them.
Michelle, hold that thought. We have to take a break,
excellent.
And we'll be back in a few minutes on Security Guy Radio. Paul, can you hear me through that?
Yeah, there we go. It's
Loud
back
music.
on.
Can you
It's
hear me?
back on.
Welcome back to Security Guy Radio. Paul, you had a great question. Go.
Yeah, Michelle, getting back to the training law enforcement issue, I got involved in stalking, domestic violence a long time ago. And when I first got involved, mainly in the UK, I suppose, originally, I had real problems as a police officer, and just a person, I guess, understanding why a victim, a target, would have coffee or go out to a meal, etc., with the suspect, after obviously being stalked. Even then, you knew there was something wrong, going back a long time. How do you train officers to understand that, and then also how do you train officers to understand the mentality of a stalker? Because I find it difficult. I think some people find it difficult to actually understand that those two pieces of it, which come
Sure.
together. They've got to both come together to understand the whole what's going on.
Yeah, I think those are really critical, and particularly the first part that you mentioned in terms of victims maintaining contact with their offenders, that this on the surface seems absolutely counterintuitive. And I think for law enforcement, not only does it seem counterintuitive, but it becomes a frustration in that if part of your job is having to prove this element of fear, how are you supposed to say that this victim is afraid of this person if they're maintaining contact? But when we break down the victim's behavior, often what we see is that victims maintain contact as a way to actually negotiate for their own safety.
That's
So
right.
we typically advise victims to disengage from the offender, to not have any contact, because for our stalkers, any contact, even negative contact, can reinforce their behavior. So, for instance, if I'm a stalker and I call you 100 times over the course of a day, and 100 times you let it go to voicemail, but the 101st time you are so sick of me calling you, you pick up and say, stop calling me, and hang up on me. Well, the next day I'm going to call you at least 101 times, because that's how many times it took for me to get you to answer.
Yeah.
That's how many times it took for me to get you to hear, for me to hear your voice. That's how many times it essentially took for me to hear you tell me how much you care about me, because you answered my call. So clearly you care about me. So for stalkers, any contact, even negative contact, can reinforce their behavior, which is why we typically advise total disengagement. But we often have victims saying to us, look, if he is calling me at 2 in the morning, I'm going to answer, because if I don't, he's going to show up on my doorstep. And I would much rather deal with him on the phone than in person. And what we know is that victims will often, for a long time before they ever report to law enforcement, be engaging in these self-initiated strategies to try and keep themselves safe, which in many cases involve maintained contact. I had a prosecutor a few years call me about a case she was working where she believed she had a strong case, but she knew the defense was going to bring up the fact, to argue against the fear element, that the victim called the offender every morning before she left for work. And in further exploring this with the victim, what she learned eventually was that the victim called the offender every morning because if he answered the phone, she knew he was at home across town. And so those mornings she could leave her house, get in her car, and go to work safely. But if he didn't answer the phone, she didn't know where he was. He might have been waiting for her at the end of her driveway. So those days, she didn't go to work. She called in sick, or she telecommuted. So many of these cases where we see victims having contact, whether it's via phone or in person, they're doing it actually as a way to try and keep themselves safe. That so often they know these offenders because they're in a relationship or have been in a relationship. They know this person's triggers. They're just trying to figure out some way to make the best possible situation, particularly if they have experienced a lack of response from law enforcement. They often feel like they're left to manage this entirely themselves.
And that's why it's so important for prosecutors to be trained on this, so they can, if they have that kind of behavior going on, so they can explain it to the trier of fact, so they can explain the victim's mentality to the trier of fact.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. In victimology, people do intuitively kind of know what they need to do to feel safe. They know when they don't feel safe, and I can see people doing that. The challenge is, when you're reporting this to a law enforcement agency, are you shooting yourself in the foot if the guy behind the desk isn't trained to understand that, that's what I'm doing. I'm calling the guy because if I don't, he's going to come kill me. Don't you get it there, Mr. Desk Officer? So Michelle, how do you get that line officer from a practical point of view? How do you train? Is it in department training? Is it online webinar stuff? Do you go out and visit people? How do you get it done?
I think you can get it done any way you can is really, for us, the bottom line. And we at least try and meet folks where they're at and where their capacity is. And so we train in a lot of different ways. So we will go on site and do training at police departments, or, to a multidisciplinary group in a community that includes police, prosecutors, victim service providers, and other professionals. It may be we're putting on a webinar, a series of webinars that anybody can access at any point in time. It might be through something like a training DVD or an online training. It may also be we've done a number of train the trainer programs where we have actually trained officers who then become that designated stalking trainer for their department. So then they're their in-house resource who can do periodic roll call trainings or in-service trainings with their patrol officers or their detectives or investigators, and be that ongoing resource within that department and within that community. So really, we are all about getting the information to people in whatever way they will best be able to access it and use it. And so sometimes that's doing training. Sometimes it's a combination of training and also resources. So sometimes it's working with departments to create policies or protocols. So maybe we don't have an opportunity to do the training, but we can at least create a departmental policy that gives guidance to every single officer in that department as to this is how we in our department respond to these cases. And every single officer in our department is going to be expected to follow this policy or follow those protocols. So it's really creating the resources, creating the training opportunities to get people what they need however we possibly can.
Paul and I have talked
Now,
about...
have you seen, since you've been doing this training, and your center you've had the Stalking Resource Center for about 10 years, is that correct?
We were founded in 2000, so we're in our 14th year.
Oh, 14th year, wow. So have you seen an increase in the number of prosecutions of stalking cases throughout the country since your, since you started?
It's a good question. Unfortunately, we don't have any hard data. What becomes challenging is, stalking is not a crime, or it's not at least one of the crimes that is specifically reported under the Uniform Crime Report, either under the UCR or under NIBRS. And so often you don't have departments actually being required to track it. Same with prosecution. We do have some states that might do it on a state level or some places that do it on a county level. But what I can say is, even if I can't give you hard numbers, is anecdotally we hear from a lot more prosecutors that they are doing more of these cases. We can point to units that have dedicated prosecutors for stalking crimes or high-risk domestic violence crimes. We can point to dedicated probation or parole units. And so I think the fact that there have been these dedicated system responses most likely wouldn't be occurring if there wasn't a volume of these cases that would justify the resources that are being spent to create those resources. So I do think practically and at least anecdotally we are seeing an increase in investigations and arrests and in prosecutions.
Michelle, unfortunately, we are out of time. It flew by. Will you come on again?
I would love to.
Let's
Great
have
to have you.
Let's have your website so people can
Thanks,
contact
Michelle.
you.
That was great.
Give us your website, Michelle.
Our website is victimsofcrime.org/SRC. Or if you just do an online search for the Stalking Resource Center, you will find us.
Excellent. Michelle Garcia, Director of Stalking Resource Center in Washington, D.C. You heard it here on Security Guy Radio. Thanks for listening in, and join us next Monday at 7 p.m.
Keep safe out there.